Hi.
This is Team Ninja RE, and we are live.
Hi, I'm Kelsey Dunlap. I'm your host for today. Welcome to Buyer Agent Compensation Conversations, the podcast where we will dive deep into one of the most critical yet often misunderstood aspects of real estate: how buyer agents are compensated and what it means for both real estate professionals and consumers. And whether you're a seasoned real estate agent or someone looking to buy or sell a home or just interested in the housing market, this podcast is for you.
That's right. Today we're going to unpack a topic that can be a point of confusion for most listing agents right now, and that is how do you handle buyer compensation with the new rules when representing a seller, where you're going to get the most impact for your seller and make sure that you get paid. Hank?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is exactly kind of an extension of what we talked about last week. So last week, what did we chat about?
Last week, we talked about the buyer side, and when you're representing a buyer, how to make sure that you are locking your buyer up in an agreement with your buyer. And then we said, instead of calling the agent on the other side and asking what they're offering and putting yourself in a box, going and writing your offer with the buyer compensation that the buyer's getting paid, the buyer's paying you already built in, if that's your strategy. Oh, and if you have a buyer that's paying cash, we talked about maybe leaving the buyer agent compensation out completely and explaining to your buyer that's going to cost them the same amount either way now. So they might as well take it out completely and go for the bottom line when making an offer.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we continue that conversation. And what we're going to chat about today is the listing side of it.
Correct. Yeah. Now, a lot of confusion. You have a lot of agents that are going to sellers, and what they're saying to the seller basically is, hey, Mr. Seller, the rules have changed. We're not able to put in the MLS how much you're paying the buyer agent. But if you don't offer the buyer agent something, you're going to be in a position where they're not going to show your listing. And so basically, they're continuing that same conversation that they were having before putting a offer of compensation was off the table, actually back when it was still mandatory. Now that it's not mandatory to publish an offer of compensation, the rules have changed, don't you think?
Yeah, big time the rules have changed. Mm-hmm. And so now we're kind of in uncharted waters. And so from my standpoint, it's just a word flip.
It is.
It's we're having a conversation that's the same but's different.
It is. It is. And here's why. Before, it was mandatory to offer something. So if you're required to offer something and then you offered a low amount, yes, you could potentially put your seller at a disadvantage in a competitive market. People didn't talk about this much, but there were still buyers that were signing buyer agency agreements with their agent. And technically, if a buyer signed a 3% buyer agency agreement, for example, and there was a listing and it was only offering 1.5, and they took the deal, the buyer would be obligated to make up the difference unless the agent specifically waived the difference.
Yeah, no, and one of the things that I've noticed is with my sellers, the conversation's still the same. Like, it hasn't changed.
Yeah.
It's really just kind of, they're more questioning what it is and how it all works now. And so, I mean, from my standpoint, the first thing that I say after I've proven my value is, hey, now what we need to do is we need to establish, what my value is and how much I'm going to get paid on the listing side. So let's just say that I go in and I say my value is 3%. So for that 3%, I'm going to do 1 through 100. I'm going to do all these things for that. Now that we've established what my compensation is as a listing agent, let's talk about the buyer agent side now. And what does that look like? And the first question I always ask is, are you willing to compensate a buyer agent for bringing the buyer to your property? And most of my sellers are like, yeah, we understand. It's how we've always done business. Nothing changes. And we're just going to roll with it. And we're going to offer compensation. So from that, I say, okay, well, do you have a specific number in mind? Have you thought about this? Do we need to talk about this more? And they may say, you know what, Hank, I understand. Let's do 3%. And I say, okay, great. That's what we'll do. Now, to the flip of that, though, Ralph, and what we can really get into is the conversation, how it evolves.
Yep.
And the way of this evolution of this conversation is, hey, I know you're willing to offer 3%, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, to a buyer agent.
Right.
That brings you the buyer.
Right.
I say, but let's do things a little bit differently. Instead of showing all of our cards and giving up our leverage, why don't we say, when an agent calls us, when a buyer agent calls us and says, is the seller compensating? We just say, yes, they're willing to compensate. Well, if they say, how much? I say, listen, put it in with your offer. Submit it with your offer. And now we have an addendum that's not only, basically it makes the offer contingent on the seller signing for some sort of compensation.
Yes.
And well, I shouldn't say for some sort of compensation. Either, yes, I'm going to pay, here's how much it is, or no, I'm not paying.
Correct.
So, and I think it's addendum GG for us, but I think most states are actually going to adopt this.
Yep.
So that we don't have buyers and sellers executing contracts when the compensation is not figured out yet.
Correct.
And so that is what I'm having. And
For example, I'm licensed also in Wisconsin still,
Right.
and the Wisconsin contract is building it right into the main contract itself.
Right.
They're just rewriting the entire WB11, which is the residential offer to purchase, and all of that is built right in. How much is the compensation? Who's responsible for paying it?
Mm-hmm.
Right on it.
And
Even
how much?
And how much? Even if the buyer's paying their own agent, it ends up on the contract.
Yeah.
That the buyer's paying their agent 3%.
Yeah.
So that everybody understands how the compensation is being ironed out from what I understand there. And I think that's a fantastic way to do it.
I think so too.
Transparency.
100% transparency. And that was the whole thing. When this all came out, I said, we were being transparent and we were showing our value. The good agents were going through listing agreements and saying, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, here's it is. Here's my value. Here's the total compensation. If a buyer agent brings a buyer, here's what they're going to get. It's not A plus B equals C. It's A is the total, and we're going to split A in half most likely, and we're going to offer half of A to the buyer agent.
Right.
And then the listing agent keeps the other half.
Right.
And I think that was just a big misconception.
It was a misconception, and B, even in the cases where it happened to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I have a problem. I'm a good agent. All right.
Yeah.
Why should I get compensated less for one property because that listing agent wasn't as good of an agent as I was, and they didn't command as much of a commission, and therefore they had a smaller amount to split with me? Why should I get paid less because a less skilled agent is on the other side of the other transaction?
Yeah.
It shouldn't affect my pay. Yeah. And so this puts you in a position where it doesn't affect your pay, because one of the key performance indicators that I have in my agreement with my buyers is that I'm going to save them a certain percentage below market value or below asking price, or whatever happens to be. We actually sit down and we figure out what those are. Now, that's not in the contract, but it is in a written agreement between them and I, that these are the things, these are the goals that we are going after together. By the way, if I don't reach that goal, I'm going to discount your commission.
Yeah.
And so, hey, I'm going to charge you 3%, but I'm going to make sure you're in the, let's say you're in the $500,000 price range. I do amounts instead of percentages. You're looking for a home between $450,000 and $550,000. Listen, I'm going to save you at least $10,000 off of list price. And if not, I'm only going to charge you 2.5% because I didn't do my job.
Right.
And so you're able to have that conversation with them. And what the listing agent is willing to offer is a separate issue altogether. And the stronger your buyer, by the way, the easier this becomes, because a strong buyer has money.
Right.
When you have a weaker buyer, when I say weak financially, you have somebody that's buying VA and they don't have any money for their own closing costs and everything else. Now you are in a weaker negotiating position for your buyer. Your buyer's in a weaker negotiating position, just as they always have been. But now that affects your pay as well if they're in a weaker negotiating position.
Yeah. And not just VA, FHA buyers as well.
Yep.
You know, and the reason they go that way is the down payment is 3.5%.
Yep.
And then it comes up with, okay, if I'm struggling to get to 3.5% down, how am I going to compensate my agent?
Right.
1%, 2%, 3%
Right.
on top of that. And
now there are changes on the lending side. They're going to start
are.
allowing for that on the buyer side and working into the financing with
Correct.
FHA and VA. So that is where we can capture some of that strength back, but now that still cuts under their debt ratios. And you got a first time home buyer, they're like, oh my God, so I'm paying $100,000 for this house, and now I have to pay $102,500 because I'm paying you 2.5%, or I'm paying, which is the more likely, $417,000 because that's the new average price.
Yeah.
For this house.
Yep.
And now we're talking about $12,000 on top of that price. If I have to finance all of my end of paying my agent, now I'm going to try and find an agent that's not charging me 3. I'm going to try and find an agent that's charging me 2.5 or charging me 1. And it becomes a little more problematic. Unless you can justify your value. And that's where this comes in. Listen, I'm going to save you $10,000. I'm going to save you $15,000 off a list price. I'm going to work with a lender to make sure I'm getting you the best rate. There's a lot of things that I'm going to do for you to save you money. And that's going to more than make up for the fact that I'm charging more than you could probably find somebody else for, but that somebody else is going to cost you way more than they're charging you.
Right. Exactly.
So here we are back on the buyer side, but let's flip the script to the seller side. Mm-hmm. Why, when working with the seller, would you give their money away without knowing how much you need to give away? And that's the problem with, let's say, offering a blanket 3%. You might have an agent come in who's only going to ask for 1.5% because that's already their agreement with their buyer. Where if they know the offer is 3, they're going to go back to the buyer and say, hey, they're paying 3. Can we change our agreement so I get the whole 3 because they're paying it anyway? It doesn't come out of your end at all. They already set the offer. No matter who sells it, they're paying 3%. And there's a lot of times when I think a buyer agent is going to get their buyer to go along with that because the buyer's just happy they're not the one paying.
Right. Exactly.
So now you just gave away an extra 1.5% on your seller for no reason.
Well, what's funny about that too is there's been a lot of people out there talking, and one of the concepts that I've really embraced and kind of really makes a lot of sense to me is the fact that buyers technically have been paying commissions
all along,
compensation all along. So do you mind diving into what you feel like, how that kind of came about
in the first place,
in terms of like, why am I right now saying that buyers have always paid for the commissions?
Because the commissions are always built into the price. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And
who pays the price?
The buyer pays for the entire piece of real estate. That not only were they paying their commission, they're paying the listing agent's commission.
Yep, exactly.
So the funny thing is, we have this all backwards of the listing agent is paying the buyer agent commission, but the listing agent isn't paying the listing. The seller isn't paying anything. The seller is getting paid.
Yeah, right.
They're getting paid for their asset. The person doing the paying is the buyer. Yeah. Bottom line. So it doesn't really matter if they pay for it in the purchase price or they pay for it outside the purchase price. The only thing that matters is whether or not it's included in the financing, whether or not they have enough cash on hand to execute the purchase. Yep. Which is why, again, I worked with a buyer. I told the story last week. She was paying cash. I said, we are going to go in heavy. We're going to go in hard and try and beat them up on price. And we're going to tell them that they don't need to bother with paying you. You're already paying your own buyer agent. What that basically does is it gets you in a gun measuring contest with the other side, and you have the bigger gun when you can walk in and say, I'm paying cash and I'm paying my own agent. I don't need your help. I want this place for the right price.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, and so we've kind of covered this, and I'll get to another aspect in a moment, but I know Kelsey had a question, and I think we can both answer it. But
sure.
What do you got?
So what if a seller says, I'm not paying a buyer agent?
Ooh.
In the listing presentation? Well, then I explained to them first of all, it doesn't get to that point with me because I'm sitting down with them and I'm explaining to them right from the beginning. There's going to be a buyer. They're going to have an agent. Either they're going to pay their agent and offer you less, or they're going to have you pay their agent and they're going to offer you more. But either way, that's always going to be part of the scenario, unless they come directly to me.
Well, let's tackle it this way. What if, because we're going to have new agents watching this.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And we're going to have inexperienced agents. So I wouldn't say necessarily new agents, but inexperienced agents that are having this conversation. with the seller, and they are going to be forced to have this this talking point of a seller telling them, no, I'm not paying the buyer agent compensation.
I've
So
seen the news, all the NAR things that are going on. I shouldn't have to pay. There was a whole lawsuit against that. So
Yep.
I think
So
that's a big thing.
if we're gonna kind of flip this a little bit, so like you have your script and it's gonna work.
Yes.
And I hope that these agents take that and heed that. But for those just starting out, not that comfortable, they're sitting across from a seller, says, I'm not paying buyer agent compensation.
Yes.
One of the first things that I'm saying is I say, I understand that and I respect that. And I understand that you don't want to pay it, but here's the reality. And the reality is that agents are greedy, and agents will not show your property if you're not offering any compensation. And that's the reality.
Well,
We're not supposed to do it.
It's not even that they're greedy. It's simply nobody goes to work for free.
Well, true that.
Nobody goes to work for free. And if a buyer agent is working with a buyer and they already have a signed contract that says that they're going to pay their agent a certain amount of commission, no matter what that amount is, because it's negotiable, and that buyer is tight on money, and that buyer knows that you're not going to pay their agent, they're going to move on and offer on a different house where they don't have to worry about coming out of pocket to pay their agent because they're already in a contract with that agent.
Right.
So now you might have that small pool of buyers that doesn't have an agent and they'll call the listing agent directly, but that's what, a couple percent of the market total. And yes, it might grow because of this. Let's say it quadruples. So it's 5% of the market or 6% of the market. Do you really want, as a seller, to have your home only open to 6% of the buyers out there, or do you want it open to 100% of the buyers out there?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the ways a newer or inexperienced agent can take the conversation is say, okay, I understand that. What do you want to net? What are we looking to get out of this property? Let's do an exercise right now. And with every single listing presentation that I do, I always have a seller net sheet.
Yes.
It's mandatory.
Yes.
And I learned that very early on in my career. And for anybody that writes in here, emails here, anything like that, I will send you my seller net sheet. And you can basically, it's Excel, so it's easily manipulative. If you're here in Florida, you don't really have to do anything unless you're selling primarily in Collier County, because typically there the buyer will pay for the home or the title policy.
Right.
Here in Lee and most other counties, I did find out Sarasota County though, the buyer does pick and pay.
Just like Collier. Huh?
Yep, just like Collier. But most of the other counties, it is
seller pays.
Seller pays.
Yeah.
So my seller net sheet is really dialed in for the state of Florida, but you can manipulate it, like I said.
And most title companies, by the way, if you're doing business, will give you one of these for free as well.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's
I actually use I use my title company's net sheet all the time, and as a matter of fact, I can convert it right to an order. Correct. Once we go under contract, which is kind of nice because they already know where we are with those net proceeds.
And you're not always going to have that title company available to you. And that's where a good seller net sheet comes in. And so from me and my my business, every single listing presentation, I don't care if I know them or what else, but I always have that seller net sheet for them. And so if a seller comes to me and says, hey, I'm not going to pay a buyer agent, I say, okay, well, let's move away from that for a second. Let's talk about the three prices that I put on my seller net sheet minus your expenses.
Absolutely.
And this is going to be your net.
Yeah.
Okay. So because you're getting what you want, would you take that and actually give that to a buyer agent?
Right.
You know, so it's just having that other conversation.
Here's one that I use. I just thought I would put this out there
absolutely.
because then you get an idea. But super easy. So let's say our sales price is where was $417,000.
There you go.
All right. And we got seller fee and broker buyer fee are separate. Right now it says 3 and 5. That's not normal, but that happens.
There's no such thing as normal anymore, right?
So look at this. the buyer broker fee, is it being paid by the buyer, by the seller, or is it being split between the two of them? So that's even in there as well. So let's say the buyer broker fee ends up being, 2.75%, and we're going to split it here, or we can have the seller paying it. All right. Are there any repairs? Are there any other miscellaneous? What are the real estate taxes? What is their loan balance? What is their interest rate? What is the closing date? I can manipulate that. I can change it. So let's say we're going to be November 15th. Hit compute. And there it is. It's going to tell them exactly what they're getting. And then I can turn it into a couple of different reports for them.
Yeah. Okay. That's cool.
Yeah. So what format do I want to put it in? This is the one I normally use as the second one, right?
Yep. Yeah,
Right
it has
here.
a nice breakdown of everything.
It does. It has it all broken down. It shows that little chart still, what it is, right here. But I think this one here is one of the cleaner ones in there. But they have so many different options right here.
Right.
But that second one, I just like the way it says net sheet right there. It gives them the amount on top and then tells them how they arrived there,
Right.
which I think is really nice, because this number right here is the number that we're working on. This is the number that matters to them. Nothing else really matters. And so I like working from that number when we go to the pricing, everything else. And then we talk about buyer broker compensation from there. And we say, listen, if somebody comes in at this price, it's already priced in. If they come in lower than this price, well, then we're going to have to talk about, are they paying their own agent or the buyer, or are they paying partial, or are we going to end up paying less?
Yeah.
So when someone says, I'm not paying and I want, $385,000 when it's done, great. Here's the price to get there. Here's the price to get there paying a buyer agent. By the way, you're going to get that much more just by offering. So let's do it. Let's have that built in. And you already told me where you want to be for your bottom line. We're going to work backwards on getting there.
Well, to come back to what I said earlier about a seller agreeing to pay 3%, let's say, and an offer comes in, and the other agent, before the offer comes in, the other agent says, hey, is the seller paying any compensation? And my line moving forward, and I've kind of learned this from the best, is yes, they're willing to pay, put it in your offer. Now, I know the seller's willing to pay 3%.
Right.
That other agent doesn't know, and the buyer doesn't know. So now if they put an offer in, and let's just say we're using 417,000 because that's the average. We'll just use 400,000 for fun.
Yep.
And they give us an offer at 350,000 and they want 3%. Well, the seller can then counter and be like, no, I want 375 and I'm only paying the agent 2%.
Yep.
Well,
or this is my bottom line.
Yeah.
Mr. Buyer, you and your agent go talk with each other and you figure out how to get, I don't really care how you get there.
Yep.
And that's, as an agent, what I would give as advice to my seller is, let's get to your bottom line and give them the flexibility to get there however they need to, because however they get there doesn't matter. What matters is what you get.
Yeah.
And boy, that's a big thing that agents don't do. Agents always get in the business of telling the other agent how to do business instead of negotiating what their customer or their client's bottom line is.
And then you're really, truly negotiating for your client or customer, like you said, for their best interest and their money.
Right.
I always treat their money like
it's mine.
Money,
yeah.
You know, 100%. So when we're having those conversations, and let's just say that the buyer agent writes in an offer for full price, $400,000, and writes in there 2%. Awesome. Seller takes it. I look like an absolute rock star.
Hero. Yep.
Because I just saved them a point. I just saved them $4,000 that now gets added to their net.
You're like
by doing that.
You're like an 8th degree black belt ninja.
And here's what's amazing. Did I still get my 3%?
Ding, 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 ding.
Oh, I still got my 3%. I showed my value and I really worked for the client or customer. And that's what it's all about. It's not just getting paid.
It's what I've been saying all along.
Yeah.
The good agents are getting a pay raise from this change.
Yeah.
And the bad agents are getting their pay cut. Yes. So if anything, this has created more capitalism in the space of the real estate industry. Less socialism, more capitalism. And I think that's a really good place to leave this.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Do we have any other questions from our audience that got emailed in or anything else?
No, I think that's it for tonight.
Well, we're keeping it short and sweet this week. By the way, if you are on the podcast, or I'm sorry, the webinar version of this and not the podcast, and you want to know a little bit about the company that we're with and how it has empowered us to take our careers to the next level, stick around after the live stream and we're going to talk with you about that. And by the way, if you're watching the webinar or the podcast version on YouTube and you would like to attend the webinar, I'm getting webinar and podcast backwards. In the description of this will be a link. Go ahead and sign up, and we'll get you into the next webinar where we will spend an extra 20 to 30 minutes and dive a little deeper with you and your career. And we will show you how we've been able to take our careers to the next level with our company.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. And that's it for today, the 1st of October, episode 4 of the Team Ninja RE podcast. I'm Ralph Nudie.
I'm Hank Bertadato.
And I'm Kelsey Dunlap.